as chair of the 2229 Main Street Advisory Committee, I'm calling this meeting of February 13th, 2024 to order. This is a weather-induced be in the warmth of your homes. So let me start by calling the roll. I'll just go on the screen. Carrie Flood, who's on mute. Okay, she's there. We'll come back to her. Rich Feely.
Here.
David Ropeek.
Here.
Gary Kleiman.
Here.
Pam Hill.
Here.
Carl Seidman.
Here.
Court Booth.
Here.
And we'll see when Carrie connects, but I see her on the Zoom. So let me just, a couple of things, since this is an all Zoom meeting, let me talk about a bit of Kurt Herman adding. Calling the roll, Kurt. Just say present.
Present.
Great. Okay. Good group on a semi-snowing evening. So a little Zoom etiquette tonight. Just talking and just going when across the table. If we can use the raise hand function here, I will call people as they raise their hand, try that out, as opposed to kind of talking to each other over in Zoom. So everybody knows what that is on the bottom, right? The raise hand. Everybody know what that is? Or you can just raise your hand, right? Okay, so let's do that. And members of the public, welcome here. But if you can, both take off camera and be on Zoom. We'll just have the committee members on the video. Okay. So welcome again. We have a kind of a short agenda, but you know, who knows how the conversation may go. Let's start by reviewing the minutes of the previous meeting. I can put those on the screen if you wish. Hopefully you've had a chance to review those minutes. Does anybody want to look at those on the screen as we go through them with comments?
I haven't had a chance to look at those. So I don't care. I mean, if you want to do that, that would be, I can abstain.
Okay.
I looked at them. If you could put them up just to jog my memory. I don't think I had any comments.
Okay, so you're all seeing that now, the minutes. I put some headings on here, Rich, just this is call to order. We discussed documents and what we were going to do about collecting documents. We had our work stream updates. We had a brief insurance discussion at the end. And then we had a few other updates, which included some changes on the remediation at the holding base of it, and it's the minutes. Does anybody have any edits or comments?
Move to approve. Second.
Okay, let me call the roll. Respond with aye or nay. Rich Feely.
Aye.
Gary Kleiman.
Aye.
Court Booth.
Aye.
David Ropeek.
Aye.
Carl Seidman.
Aye.
Carrie Flood.
You may see me on two different computers. I'm going to go downstairs and close off the one that isn't working tonight, but I'm here.
You're here, and do you vote on the minutes? Do you approve?
Yes, I approve the minutes. I have read them. Didn't hear the motion, but I have read them.
Okay, have I missed Kurt Herman? Did I get you?
I need to abstain, Paul. I wasn't there at the meeting.
Okay, and Pam Hill will abstain, so I approve as well. So we have approval of the minutes, Rich, as written. Thank you very much. So the next order of business is work stream updates as usual. what I want to do here is go through the updates, but then return to our plan, your favorite chart, because there've been some changes and there was some discussion on the last meeting about a couple of things that I want to get back to. But let's start with the work stream updates, and brief or at length, depending on what you have to report. So can we start with the legal work stream? Court and Pam, where we are, any updates?
Sure. Pam, help me out here. Number one, we're working with Megan and Chris to get a budget status report with the attorneys. Two, we are hoping that there would be a little refinement of the liability evaluation or analysis that Anderson and Krieger has done to finish up that piece for this stage. Third, we are hopeful that the previous work can reach a conclusion for, again, this stage. That's the caveat for this stage, with a recommended acquisition path should the town pursue it. That I think is pretty high level, but I trust that's an accurate telling. Pam, Paul's been involved in some of this as well, so I'd ask either one of you to add or edit.
I think that's where we are. There's a meeting scheduled that is being called, I think, mostly by Paul with EPA about some of these issues, especially liens that will maybe occur in the end of the month. And other than that, we're kind of on track, I think, to have a pretty clean piece on liens, but and a more well-developed sense of the liability issues and how we can mitigate them, coming in hopefully another piece of the memo that we have already seen some of. So it's about it, I think.
Yeah, just to add a bit to that, we do have a meeting with EPA and DOJ. This is with Kara, who she and I kind of orchestrated this, but it will be with the attorneys from EPA and DOJ as well, and our attorney, Mina Markarias, will be there. So it's basically an information session, a learning session, specifically designed to get more information on the federal liens. Because as you know, we've had communications over the last few years about the federal government, EPA and DOJ releasing the town from the liens under certain circumstances. So we want to get a little bit more richness on that. So when we do make our recommendations to the select, what that decision-making may be. So that's the primary purpose of that meeting. It will be in person at the townhouse on the 29th.
Here's one other thing I could add. This is my understanding. Tell me if Pam, you think I have it right. We've asked Mina to uncouple the acquisition work from the liability protection work, understanding that on any town implementation of any strategy, those two come back together again. They'll be a bit interdependent, but right now we're trying to uncouple them for the clearest understanding possible.
Yeah, I think that's right. And the reason, I think, in part is that we are more comfortable making public the lien component, and the second component being the liability component, which we would like, which may need to remain confidential for a while, will be separated, and there will be, we hope, a pathway appendix to that will help us understand how to move forward should we want to acquire. Yeah.
Yeah, we have asked Mina to define a specific recommended acquisition pathway and maybe the pros and cons of different alternatives, but to give us an opinion on the pathway forward. And there are, a limited number of pathways and the different options, pros and cons. And out of those acquisition pathways, some of the liability protections do emerge. There are other liability protections that are somewhat independent of that pathway, that we have to negotiate later on with EPA, such as things like covenants not to sue and other things, which are kind of independent of the pathway. So as court indicated, there's a connection between the pathway chosen and the liability protections. But there's more to each. Advise us.
I think that the liability pathway issue, the covenants, the amended, whatever, all those things, windfall lien protections, you name it, those things are part of that pathway. They're not separated. They're very,
Okay, yeah, maybe just a different point of view, how we view those. There are other things in MENA's scope that we'll have to return to, because remember, there are legal issues that we all have discussed, such as what happens after the town acquires the site, what are the liability protections and insurance issues. Those are all legal issues, but I think the team wants to focus MENA at this point on getting us to how we want to acquire the site. If we want to acquire the site, how we want to acquire the site, and then what are the liability protections afforded to the town. Those are the important sort of upfront pieces that, depending on timing, we want him to look at as well. So one thing I want to mention, so all this is, I know these are terms and balls bouncing around. I have an idea of one of our meetings in March, when the legal team is ready and when MENA is ready to hold an executive session with this task force to kind of go over these details, to find out sort of by the end of March where we are, what are the things we know, what are the things we need to know to make recommendations to the select board, and some of the details. And I think that probably has to be a privileged conversation. So no details, but I'm just thinking in terms of scheduling that, one of our meetings in March, we have one more meeting in February and 2 in March, would be appropriate to kind of, all get on the same wavelength as where we are. And so, MENA can hear your questions as well as the questions that the legal team has thrown at him. So more how to make more sense out of such a meeting, but that was my thinking, Court and Pam, at this point. It's not a surprise. We talked about it before.
yeah, we have to think about that and the utility and how it would work, I think. And then there's the question, I'm not a specialist in municipal law, but what the basis for an executive meeting is, I suppose I suppose we can pass that
Yeah, we
hurdle.
will. It's about strategy more than anything. So
Yeah, I just would like to hear from, Chris or Megan or something on that.
yeah, I've discussed it a bit with Chris and Megan. We can give some more detail, but I'm just throwing that out there, sort of scheduling the idea. And look, the reason why I think it's a team discussion, because when the team makes a recommendation, I think we all have to be aware of all the facets, whether it's reuse, whether it's ownership, whether it's risk, or whether it's acquisition. We have to be aware of all those, so that everybody understands, right?
Paul, I don't know if it's just me. I think you're breaking up occasionally. Are others noticing that?
I am.
So
I am.
if we miss a big chunk, we'll have you dial back and repeat. I think we're filling in the blanks okay so far.
Okay, am I live now?
You are, just, every 2 minutes, we lose you for 4 or 5 seconds. Something like that.
Let me just put on a different connection. If I lose you, I'll dial back in, okay?
You bet. And while Paul's doing that, I'll mention, Pam, around the executive session, we'll put right in the agenda the legal language for us going into public session and then voting to go into into executive session.
Right,
So-
exactly, right.
Right. Okay, is my connection a bit more stable now? Maybe
We'll know soon. It sounds great now.
I got a stronger internet connection here. Okay. So that's the legal updates. Anything new on the risk front, Kurt and David?
We have a call scheduled with Rue for Thursday this week to get an update on their methodology and kind of preliminary findings. So I don't think there's a lot to update on at this point, but we should be in good shape to give a preliminary update for our next meeting. And then I think we're on schedule. Rue's a little bit behind schedule, but I think their newest deadline or target date to have results is in mid-March. I think the date was roughly March 13th, although I could be wrong about the specific date. And the delay was just based on their receipt of the data from the consultants. So they're making progress, but we're looking to get a good interim update on Thursday, and then hopefully we'll get them to present their overall conclusion at some point in the near term.
Do you think at some point, Kurt, that we want them to present to the task force? I say that not knowing that their budget is, Chris, but I'm just wondering if that might be a good thing to plan and maybe schedule for April or something like that.
I think so. I think once they get their draft results, we'll want to take a look at them. Maybe David and I can take a peek at the initial results, give them feedback, and then based on that, they can give an update to the entire task force.
But all the work streams will be able to see the draft results as soon as they're available. Like, we don't have to wait till April, right, for our work stream to see the preliminary findings.
I think that's fine.
Great.
I think taking with a grain of salt that we may have comments and just want to see a different presentation or just want to dig into either the method or the results a little more, but I don't see any reason not to share the draft results throughout the task force.
So David, on the public communication, I want to talk about that in the context of the schedule that that's sort of the next piece. If you can kind of hold off on any thoughts about more public forums or risk communication, unless you have some right now you want to share.
No, except that the idea of having the consultant present to the whole committee is part of a public meeting is a good transparency gesture. Not that a lot of people will attend, but they can be invited, and so that's a good idea for that reason too.
Okay.
That's all.
Okay, any comments or questions for the risk group? Gary and Rich on reuse, are you sort of in a holding pattern here or?
No,
No,
still
good.
doing things. I mean, I would offer up 3 points that Rich can add to. One, we had a good call with the Transportation Advisory Committee last week. Two, we're scheduled to speak with Mass Development tomorrow. And that will include, I think, Megan and somebody from the town, because they wanted to, in our follow-up call, make sure that town was represented. But, I think there's a lot of opportunity for collaboration with Mass Development. So we'll learn more about that tomorrow. And then the third piece is SKIO has been trying to schedule Rich has been saying this repeatedly, but we do want to have one more big developer, and we have somebody in mind, but we have been unable to schedule. So that is still to come. But, I would conclude by saying, I do think that by end of, maybe our next meeting, February 28th, I think we would be in a position to share, an updated distillation of all of our interviews, as well as, I would hope, a preliminary peek at what we're thinking on zoning, as a parallel package, what zoning would support potential uses, and the 3 scenarios that, we would hope to explore with all of the work streams as part of our integration process. And you've already seen some of that from the operations work stream. But
I'm curious, did the discussion with the Transportation Advisory Committee, did that change any thinking about, transportation hubs and things like that?
I wouldn't say it changed. It made for a richer discussion because there were actually some out of the box, thoughts as to other potential uses. But the idea of like, one node on a community public transit network seems fine. So. but
Yeah,
there-
I would say the only
Yeah.
other thing that came out of that was the idea that if, this is to be the site for DPW and town offices in the future, then it could also be a site for charging town electric vehicles, potentially even transit vehicles. But I think that's not inconsistent with that use, which is in the, currently in scenario 3. So I think it, is something we can talk about. But it looks like, we're still a significant ways from even regular transit service on Route 62 because they don't have a guaranteed source of financing for that. And anything like that requires subsidies. You can't do it on user fees. And in the long, people have talked about point to point, robo taxis or whatever. That's even further down the road. So, the nice thing is if we want to charge town vehicles and we have town offices there, you ought to be able to build it so the staff can park during the day and the town vehicles can be parked at night and charged.
And I think, again, we have to be somewhat flexible in thinking about these three scenarios, because I would say, Rich, even if we go with, scenario 1 or scenario 2, a private developer, we may still have an opportunity, as we've discussed, for having a municipal portion of the site. And so, there might be, it's just another thing to consider, but by pricing it, thinking about the infrastructure that would be required, by, contemplating it within scenario 3, I think we would have our bases covered for the town to be able to design a flexible future scenario, whatever the future holds. So that's why, but I agree with Rich, probably makes sense to build it into scenario 3.
With the caveat that I don't want to opine about private development until we talk to another bigger private developer. I definitely think the next meeting we could go through the scenarios and the logic behind them. There's much of that comes out of the distillation of the interviews, but there are a few additional pieces of analysis that are relevant. So, I think we could Gary and I could do a 15-minute presentation the next meeting if you wanted, with the caveat that if we don't talk to another big developer, I don't view the opinion on what private development might look like as being final yet.
So, guys, I don't recall, we haven't had a group discussion about the 3 scenarios that you've come up with and that you passed off to Carl and Carrie. Have we yet? Is everybody familiar with it? So
I think we posted them, didn't we?
No, I submitted them to Paul and
Oh,
to
okay.
Megan, but I don't think, it didn't get into the packet. I don't think we've discussed it as a committee.
Yeah, so the town, I guess, is working on some costs for them, but, that would be, I think next meeting,
Yeah.
we can lay those out and the logic behind them, and then we can have a discussion of them.
I think that'd be really good. And a question, so in the report, will we see those 3 scenarios from your group as modified by risk and other things, or are you limited to 3, or what's your thinking about what would actually?
Well, the 3 are a spectrum between what I would call total town use, mixed town private use, and total private development. In other words, the
Right.
town doesn't acquire, but maybe gets an easement for the transit node and maybe a dog park or something. So that's but we can't ask the town staff to cost umpteen scenarios,
Right.
but we can certainly talk before the final, recommendations about, I like scenario 2, but we want B instead of A in terms of the components in that. We can, you know.
And we'll
It's-
talk
they're
about it on
not
the
fun.
28th, but the idea is that we're not going to vote on scenario 1, scenario 2, or scenario 3. Rather, we're coming up with a bunch of components that, when all costed and considered, would represent the range of potential development pathways at some point in the future when a lot of unknowns become knowns.
Right, and I think we're using these scenarios just
Yeah.
to advise the select board on, they've seen the master plan, so here's further thinking based on real data 2 years later from town committees and lots of stakeholders, so. that makes
I
it-
also, I would like to thank Gary and Rich for inviting Carl and myself to join them for lunch a couple of weeks ago while we went through and discussed all that stuff and made a few revisions to what they had. But it also helped us, I think, to sort of envision what we were contemplating, looking for, and come up with a compiled list that makes sense. And Gary, I think you mentioned, the sort of 3 different subsets, they're representative, their details can change over time. But the 3 basic scenarios you were talking about, I think, are, representative of groups of opportunities that will occur over time, depending on the decisions we make in the next couple of years.
Yeah.
And to that point, they were meant to be illustrative scenarios. And, we view, actually, if we are invited to present them at the next meeting, like, to me, that's the start of our integration process, because we also want all of the work streams to be considering these 3 illustrative scenarios. Are there things we're missing that are, going to put the town outside the box of these 3 scenarios that need to be considered from a perspective, a legal perspective, or from a safety or a risk perspective, or from a town input perspective? We want to make sure that we're representing all of the, potential things that could come up between now and 10 years from now when the town or a private developer is doing something on this site, so that we can make sure that in doing an analysis of these 3 scenarios, we're more or less capturing the issues that the town would have to deal with. But yeah, I view this as the start of the integration. So all of, yes, we had a preliminary discussion so that the operations work stream could move ahead with their work. But I see this as the start of integration.
Yeah, I agree. David, thank you for using the hand raising function.
You're welcome. I had a question. You said you were going to read with mass development. One of the things that Carrie and Pam and I came across in researching other communities is that they unlocked a bunch of different programs out there to help defray some of the costs of what we're considering recommending to the town. And I don't recall that that was a specific area that anybody in our work streams was assigned to research. But a couple of the communities we researched talked about working with mass. I wasn't sure it was mass development. I think one of them was. And their brownfields program specifically, Pam has said some have been ruled out or some haven't. I don't know. But I wonder whether that would be an opportunity to bring that up with those people that you're meeting with tomorrow. Are there programs that can help us financially if we go ahead with scenario 1, 2, or 3?
Yeah, I think
We definitely bring that up.
Carl's been looking and thinking about some of that. Go ahead, Carl.
Okay. Yeah, so I do a lot of work in development finance, and I've done economic development planning for other communities. So I have a fairly good sense of the state programs and some of the federal programs that are available, as well as, some of the municipal tools that can be used. So I could put together it wouldn't be too hard for me to put together a sort of initial summary that we could review. We could sort of add to it if other people have other knowledge, or you heard of other sources from some of the other communities. But I could certainly start to put together, and some of it's going to depend on what the ultimate use is at the site. The mass development and the state brownfields program, I believe is for investigation and cleanup work, not for the actual post cleanup development. But there are, you know, the main infrastructure program at the state level, Mass Works, you know, makes fairly substantial grants for public infrastructure for, you know, housing, economic development, and affordable housing projects. That's probably the leading source, you know, the town might look to.
I
But
would think that that would be good advice that we could incorporate into our report.
Right.
The town would need to be able to consider what financial help would be available as it's officially finally deciding what to do based on our recommendations. So yeah, that's awesome, Carl, that you could be able to.
I could put together a starting summary that we could look at and think about.
Okay, a great segue for Carl and Carrie. Any other updates?
I guess the main update on the operations, well, two things. One is, you know, working with Gary and Rich, we put together these 3 scenarios to submit to town departments to estimate infrastructure costs and the operating costs, maintenance costs for the new infrastructure. And that was submitted to Megan at the beginning of February with a end of February deadline. So we'd have, you know, Carrie and I would have some time to review it, see if there's any back and forth and questions, and having something to share with the committee by mid-March. The other development, which you know, David and Carrie could talk more of, is the sort of summary that's in the packet that was put together on the interviews that were done with other communities.
And I think there's another example of the integration of our work streams in a couple of different aspects.
Yeah, I added that information to the meeting packet because it came in late for the last one. I'm not sure the 3 of you, David, you and Carrie, and with Pam, had ample opportunity to discuss. I mean, you covered some key points. Anything else you want to add up to that material? Because it's sitting out there in the meeting packet.
I would only encourage, yes, what the task force has is a summary of what the 3 of us were able to develop, and we met and we talked it over and we kind of synthesized basic messages and so forth. And what you now all have, I would encourage you to read, because there are a bunch of key lessons in there that seem pretty consistent. We mentioned one at the last meeting, for example. A lot of communities that were involved in the cleanup got to shape the cleanup so that they could use the cleanup to prepare the site for what they wanted to use it for eventually. Those kinds of lessons are in this packet. We talked them over. I would also add one thing that at least in 2 cases, possibly more, we could go back to those places. I'm thinking specifically of Ashland and Salem. Those are places that I investigated. Carrie and Pam might have these contacts too, I'm not sure. But they've offered, I talked to the town manager in one case and the senior town planner in Salem, and they said, if you need anything else, just call us.
Exactly.
So
I
available as a
have a couple
resource.
of
So if
people.
anything comes up for anybody, hey, how did they figure out the liability stuff? Or in any other work streams, we have those people who've gone through this as a potential resource. That's not in the
Right, I have some contacts that I can go back to with more specific questions, or, you know, so what ifs. If other members of you want to submit those questions to me, and those would be 2 communities here in Massachusetts. Also, one of the communities I tried to speak with was one that decided no interest in taking, and that's one of the very rare instances that we found in that dimension. But yes, I'm happy, you know, if you have questions. Carl, we'll be meeting again. Oh, I see Pam's got her hand up. We'll be meeting again next week, is that right? Or the week after, that we can. I think it is before our next full committee meeting, but you can submit those questions to us by email, and remember, just to us, just to one of us, not to the full committee.
Let me go with Rich and then Pam.
Yeah, I thought that was fascinating reading. The one piece that would help me, maybe for a couple where you really got more information, is a timeline of, you know, where in the cleanup and development process did towns act? Where did they decide they wanted it? Where did they actually acquire it? Because you talk about the fact that, you know, towns said if you can influence the cleanup in order to affect the kinds of development you want. I still couldn't quite figure out when a decision and a purchase were actually made along that spectrum.
Well, let me summarize, and please correct me, Pam and Carrie, if I get this wrong. My general recollection of talking with everybody was that the towns pretty early on wanted to be involved in even the cleanup planning. And so I can't answer your question specifically, Rich, but early on would be my general answer, because they wanted their hands in the cleanup process as well as just the after the fact process that we're kind of at. At the various stages, I mean, Pam looked into Slidell, Louisiana, and the EPA had a record of decision on the record already. And some folks there said, no, we can use this for a marina, but the cleanup's not going to be good enough to clean up the water. So now let's get more involved. That's one, right? Industriplex in Woburn, there's 22 owners. This is the corner of 128 and 93. 22 owners. This was one of the first Superfund sites in America. It took them years to get a custodial trust form to figure out what the hell they're going to do altogether. So the timing varies. The general message I would offer is that it seemed like most of the sites were involved earlier on in the cleanup itself, and they're thinking about what we're thinking about was relatively early on.
Pam,
So the three sites that were most similar to Concord that we looked at were actually sites that had plans for what they wanted the site to look like afterwards. They wanted municipal uses, they wanted parking lots, they wanted a marina, they wanted those things. And they became involved very early. They still have municipal ownership. There's a possibility that they might sell off some other parts. They don't find having institutional controls a problem. They don't have increases in liability insurance. Ashland, on the other in the other hand, was someone where it was a multiple owner site. It was Nyanza. There were many owners. They didn't think about it. They didn't own any of it. And then somebody tried to build something, a big housing unit there. And everyone erupted in the town. And they ended up going back and having to buy it later. So they didn't find that they could just zone it to keep housing out of it, for instance. They ended up going back later for that. So I think that's a real cautionary tale. The other sites that David is talking about are sites where there were many, many owners, and some of them were partially responsible for what was going on. And they don't really, they aren't somebody that are necessarily all indemnified for one reason or another. So it's a really hard comparison with that, the ones that took 20 years for them to decide. The three that actually had an idea, here's a municipal use I want for this site, I want to be a part of the cleanup for this site. Those were the sites that were the most successful and got the most out of it. And they did end up getting grants to help out with redevelopment, but they also put in a lot of money of their own, because they were going to need a new police station or parking for their vehicles, or they wanted to redevelop this park with a marina in it. So it's a challenge there. You know, the lesson you can actually look at from that is it's nice to go in with a plan for what you want if you're going to have municipal ownership, and you have more control over whether somebody puts housing there if you own the site.
Right, and the ones I spoke with, where I actually found somebody who was involved, working for the town at the time decisions were made. It wasn't the day the place was, declared a Superfund site. There were a few years into that kind of thing, and there was some basic knowledge about what the contaminations were, what the extent of it was, what the risk factors were. But simultaneous with that, these are towns not unlike Concord that are periodically updating long-range plans, and they have an idea of what their needs and interests are going to be, both facilities and economic base kind of stuff going forward. And the two of those sort of came together. They had consultant studies done, they had town committees, not unlike in some ways what we're going through. But the acquisitions were before the cleanup was done. And the obvious interest was there, and there were changes in the exact cleanup measure, where soil was being deposited, what areas were being cleaned up to what standard, based on what potential uses might be going forward. In one case, where they had, so this vision of things, two different operations on two different sides of the road, because of where the groundwater pumping station was going to be, they put them both on the same side of the road and then left the open space and parking on the side of the road where the permanent, or at least indefinite, groundwater pumping would take place. So they made accommodations in what their desires were, but it was a cooperative effort. And still several more years before anything was actually constructed, or any serious use put in place.
Yeah,
Some of that's still under study.
Yeah, I think the example of a town taking ownership before cleanup is completed is an important one to keep in mind, because that's going to be a question of timing for the select board. If they decide to move forward, do they wait until it's done? Are there towns that have done beforehand based on plans? So I think that's one to keep in mind. The other question I have is for you guys, which town was in a most similar situation with regards to ownership? In other words, eventually the town acquired the site when it was either in private hands or was an orphan site beforehand. And are there any sort of acquisition lessons in how a town decided how to acquire that site? Or are we completely on new territory with our site here?
Salem had a couple. Salem had a couple sites that basically they got involved again earlier at the cleanup stage than we are, but had a cleaner site, if you will, as opposed to Industriplex, which was all over the place. I think Slidell was kind of like one site. No, but I forget. I think they did acquire, but Salem had a couple, so they would be a source to look into. They had one site that they acquired intending to sell it to a private developer that fell through, that they now own as a parking lot. But in terms of sites like ours, where it's relatively clean in terms of ownership and ongoing uses and so forth, they would be a couple.
Yeah, I'm not sure it's any of them are clean, but I'm just saying which ones the town made a decision to acquire the site, and so we can look at how they did that, what method they used to do that, et cetera. Just something to think.
Louisiana did that, and basically they had a private owner that was being forced to clean it up. That it was one big site, and EPA really wanted to see an owner be part of redevelopment like they do at the StarMet site, and they actually helped them get a grant. And as part of the resolution with the company, they had the company donate the land to the town or the city of Slidell.
And so it was acquired by a donation. It was
acquired by a donation is
okay.
The only record that I found of it. I haven't actually found somebody who can say exactly how they took ownership of it, because I know there were liens, because this was a site where EPA went in and cleaned it up and then sued everybody to pay for it. And so while there was one owner, there were theoretically other principal responsible parties at the site because they had used the services of the one owner. So,
well, that's similar to here. It's just I'm just curious how the Slidell took ownership of it. You're saying by donation, and as a result, what kind of liability protection was afforded by that donation process? I'm just curious, because we're looking for a model, and it's like two snowflakes. We're not going to find the same exact model, but something that comes close that we can kind of point to as an example of successful acquisition through a certain pathway. Of course, I don't think,
Mansfield was tax title.
yeah, I don't think, excuse me, say again?
Mansfield was tax title from the
Mansfield?
previous owner who had defaulted.
And they took the type by foreclosing on the site? Okay.
That's the way I have interpreted what was told to me. I haven't read the legal documents, but yeah, he said that they defaulted and they took it on tax title.
I think that's an important model maybe to dig into, legal team a little bit. Yeah,
Mhm.
good.
So I wanted to clarify that from you would like this document updated so that it puts when the decisions were made to take ownership in the process up front, so they can be compared to, and you want to know specifically and a real list of how did they take ownership and how did they get their liability waivers.
Well, it's just the data are there. So what's the bottom line for this?
Okay.
For the site? It may not be in this document, but as you write the report, sections of the report, I think, how do we use this information to advise, enlighten the select board on what was done before, and that, this isn't brand new. Some things may be brand new, but there are important lessons to be learned where successful outcomes happened based on certain pathways. That's my thinking. And I wouldn't do anything to this right now until we figure out exactly how we're going to use it. But it's a really great effort. Thank you. Okay. Any other?
I want to thank you on that report. I've got a day job and a part-time job. David and Pam did a great deal of that work, and especially in the putting the notes together after we had met and talked. So thank you for that.
Yeah, because that question comes up all the time. What other towns, what other sites have similar histories or similar circumstances? I think that it's going to be an important part of our discussion. Okay, that's work stream updates. I'd like to move to the next part, which is the work plan update review. And I'm going to share your favorite document with you, which is this baby here. So I made a couple of changes here based on some discussions and some additional thoughts I have. So just going through this, the first two lines are the same. We're basically saying we're doing our work stream and coordinating between the work groups through the first quarter, and hopefully it'll be largely, maybe not completely done with that by the end of March. It sounds like, based on our discussion last meeting, it's a good track for doing that. We had the public forum in November. I added this line to separate RU's activity as when they would have the human health risk assessment as information, and that based on what you said, Kurt, that sounds like about somewhere in that time frame, in the March time frame. So everybody would kind of have that. And then, as I discussed earlier, it would be great by the end of March to sort of know where we are on the legal part of this, and for the task force to kind of be aware of what the recommendations are, what the opinions are. So we have whatever comfort we need on proceeding to the next stage. It's at one point, I don't know if it was Henry Dane's suggestion or mine, that, hey, at one point we may say, we can't do it, we're out of it. And I thought, well, that would probably come from the legal end of things, if there just was no way forward. I don't think that's going to be the case, but I think that's why I put that milestone on there, that, it's a key point that we have to understand, that there's a way forward. Exactly what that way forward is and how we execute that is not clear. So that's what that sort of end of March thing is. And so the suggestion that we have a discussion at one of our meetings in March came out of that thinking. Stop me at any time, raise your hand anytime you want to, or wait to the end to kill the whole thing. So then that starts us with the work stream integration, that I think whether it starts with a reuse discussion or it starts with legal discussion, or I'm not sure where it starts, but I think that period of time It starts about the beginning of April, and if you go down 3 rows, that's about the time where I would offer draft to prepare a draft report outline. I've always found in sort of big projects like this, it's always important to know sort of how we going to think and present all the stuff. So that's not going to be our final outline, but for me, that's always been a good way of thinking about, okay, how all this plays out. You note that the report drafting doesn't happen until later, but I think in terms of thinking about how we're going to integrate and thinking about how we're going to write it, my suggestion would be that we have something an outline of how the thoughts might come together. This is how, when I describe what we need to do, we have to kind of plan the soft landing at this point, so that when we get to this, the initial recommendation at the end of that period, whether that's the end of June or July, whenever that is, that's sort of our landing. So we know where we are, we know what our recommendation is, and so then we can draft the report at that point. So we could start writing sections before then if they're sort of independent. If no matter what our recommendation is, we have time to write, but we don't have to start doing that until the July-ish timeframe. Which then takes me back one step to the public forums. I think there was a discussion last week about having 2 additional public fora. And I looked at the chart, and that's not something that I ever put on the chart, but it's something that we should discuss, David and others, whether we want to add a forum. And if I remember the discussion from last time, it was the thought that maybe we'd have one which doesn't speak out our decision, but talks about sort of our findings, what we're finding in our work, sort of a work stream update kind of thing, rather than just what we did last time, which is basically say how we're going to do our work. It would be, okay, what have we found? So at this point, I'd like to just, since the hand is raised, I'd like some opinions on whether we want to add another public forum. Probably before we brief the select board, and I have the select board briefing on theirs because I think we need to let them know what we're doing and where we're heading. But whether this other public forum occurs before that or not, I'd like kind of some discussion about that. So I can take this off the screen or keep it on. Let me take it off for the moment. So the topic is a discussion of 2 public fora versus a later one, which basically tells the public what we found and what we're going to recommend. Court, go ahead.
Well, I'm thinking forum really fits into the larger objective of public outreach generally. So a somewhat leading question, are we using the bridge to full effect? Because that gets into more hands and more heads than any forum will do, I think. I wonder if that's a path that we should be considering in order to really inform the town as fully as we can, in addition to any forums we do.
Yeah, I don't know, probably others have opinion on that. My experience with media of all sorts is that there's a high probability they get it wrong. And because what we would like to be in a full page article, they want to put in a smaller, I don't know. But I think using the bridge for communication is a good idea. Whether we want to use that in place of a public forum, I think open for discussion. I don't know. Carl?
Yeah, and I support the idea of having another public forum before we come to our initial recommendations and complete our integration. I think we owe it to the public to share what we've learned, give them a chance to comment on it, perhaps ask questions we haven't thought about or raise topics we haven't thought about. But I think doing that before in the integration process, and perhaps even before we share our findings with the select board, then we sort of have some round of public comment before we go back to the select board. So I think waiting till we've come up with our recommendations is not the ideal process.
Rich, then David, then Gary. Rich?
Yeah, no, the same thing. I think we absolutely need something just before, just after we go to the select board that says, this is what we found. Here are the major options. Here are pros and cons. Here's what we know about liability. Here's what we know about acquisition. Because I think if we wait till we have a draft report, we've got the process problem again. Oh, you guys made up your mind. You never listened to us. So I strongly agree with Carl.
Just in response to that, one thing that I'm thinking about, just how much on the legal side can we actually discuss publicly? I don't know what the answer to that is. Because you say, how we're going to require it and maybe what the costs are going to be. I don't know. It gets into Pam and Cordy, to discuss everything we know about that in public. We haven't talked fully about that, and certainly haven't talked with Mina about that, but I mean, it's an important component, and we're likely to get questions about that at a public forum. But I'd like, hold off David and Gary, just like Pam, can you
No,
address that?
a very simple answer to this, which is that everything, I think Mina needs to be very deeply involved with what gets disclosed and what doesn't. It's something that needs to be vetted by the lawyer representing us. And I think we shouldn't leap to any conclusions about any of the legal things related to subsequent negotiations or the internal thinking of the town and how it might stimulate thinking by other interested parties. I think we just have to wait for Mina. It's very important.
Yeah, I'm not suggesting anything otherwise. I'm sort of questioning whether, even with Mina's concurrence on exactly how to proceed, whether we can talk about that at a public forum or not. I don't know.
It's Mina has to help us with that, is my point.
Okay, yeah, I mean, if.
That's the point.
Because I think it would be a bit empty. There are a lot of questions the public's going to have about liability protections and about how much it's going to cost. I think that's come up before. So it's just something to think about. We don't have any answers right at the moment on that. I'm just tossing that out there. David, then Gary, then Court.
Two things. I also recommend another public forum, and probably before we do the select board, because that will involve coming public with a lot of semi-recommendations, and people will wonder why we haven't shared with them another chance for input. So in terms of timing, probably prior to the select board meeting, that's up in the air. Second, I would suggest that the form of that be a relatively brief introduction by you guys, and then we break into our work groups, and people can come to the work groups that they want to discuss in more detail what those work groups found, as kind of a blending of the two meetings that you were referring to that we discussed earlier. Third, in terms of using the bridge, there is the strong possibility, I believe, that we could write something up to have it put in, so that it's more accurate, and they run things like that from various groups all the time. And as I know a few of the members of the foundation that I started to get the damn thing going, Jack Clymer and Alice Kaufman, and I don't know whether that would be appropriate or just to go straight to the editors, but that would be one way to use the bridge to reach more people with our specifics.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. And even though I sort of was a little bit negative on that earlier, they have been receptive to articles that we've submitted. I just don't know what we put in the bridge that would fully inform the public. But, I think we should be open to it and discuss it, have an ongoing discussion. Yeah. Gary?
Yeah, so I don't want to sound contrarian to the views that were expressed by, the three prior recommenders, but, whether you call it, I think it's more a syntactical thing from my perspective, whether you call it initial recommendations as written here or semi-recommendations as David alluded to, I don't think that what we come up with in the next step is set in stone yet. we're gonna come up with some information. And the idea of having a forum, you know, I think this was discussed after our last forum. It doesn't make sense to me to have a public forum if we don't have something to say. So waiting until we have something to say seems to make sense to me, as long as we're not casting it as set in stone. And I'm just wondering, it's more of a question, you know, if we were to have a public forum, sort of where you've alluded to it right here, you know, after we have our workstream integration, we have some semi recommendations, let's say at the end of our workstream integration, we've briefed the select board. My question is, could we then have another public meeting during report reviews and revision? Because to me, it doesn't make sense to not meet with the public again. Like, we then draft a report based on feedback we get from the public. And then it would make sense to have, you know, when you have a final report, you have another meeting and take comment on it. And it could be public comment as well. So I don't know why we're limited to just one more public forum. It seems to me we could have 2 meetings and have one where we present some, you know, here's our thinking at this point. We've just done some integration and here's what we're thinking. Let's take public comment and then see if anything changes, but then we draft our report and could have another public meeting for a comment.
Yeah, so I'm hearing a couple of public engagements is appropriate. I'm just scratching my head about the appropriate timing. Whether, you know, this start that I have here in July, whether we do something earlier or later than that.
And I think it's more of a question of syntax. It's what
Yeah.
you call. Don't go out there and say, this is our final recommendation and we've already made decisions. But it seems to me the timing is less important than what you're calling the content.
Yeah, so I mean, this part, workstream integration, so what is that exactly? I do know that during this time, we'll probably have 6 meetings over that time. So I think the meetings will be discussions of various aspects, and, you know, we still will be kicking things around during this period. So I don't know down below here whether we'd have a public forum in April or in advance of the select board, or whether Gary suggests maybe after. I think it's something we don't have to decide tonight. But probably we need to start thinking about this within the next month and a half.
Well, I think we should think about what's the content we want to present at that forum.
Yeah.
Well, what are suggestions, what the content would be? Are they sort of what findings, what research we've done? Because we told people what we were going to do and what questions we were going to ask. Or do we tell them, here's what we've done, here's who we've met with, here are some of the answers to the questions? Is it really sort of taking a lead from our previous forum? What do we think about, you know, Gary's question about context? Court.
I think we have to be careful to ensure that the select board is the first recipient of our report, such that any forum should do, I think, what you just described, more information about the questions that we have posed, how we have done our research, how it's going to inform a recommendation. Something in that information is going to point toward whether this group is of a mind that's going to work for the town. But I think we've got to be careful that the select board is the first one to hear the first explicit recommendation. In terms of what can be shared legal, I don't want you to interpret this as disagreeing with anything that Pam or Paul said, but I would offer up, I think there's a fine but real line between strategy on the part of our legal team, should they pursue acquisition, and known established potential moves that municipalities make in circumstances like this. Now that is public information that the EPA will share with anybody and everybody. And so if we simply gave people more information about the menu without telling people how MENA is going to set that table, I think, if you don't mind the metaphor, I think that's very appropriate and very safe. But again, MENA would have to agree. But much of this is in the public domain, easy to find, and people could pick up a phone and be told what we already know about BFPP status and covenants and so on.
I think that's well put. I do think that, we could describe how towns get liability protection and how towns can acquire sites, and, that we're still in the process of making decisions, but to give some comfort to the town that, especially on the liability side, that there are mechanisms by which municipalities acquire sites with liability protections for any past, contamination. So I think you're right. If we couch the legal piece in the public domain, that would be, I think, good. I do. It's my last thought on this. The public forum we did last time sort of set the stage. Each work stream said, here are the questions. If we do nothing more than say, okay, here are the answers that we've got to some of the questions. Here's the work we've done, the people we've spoken to, the questions that we've gotten answered, and here are the questions we still have to get answered. That would be an update, Gary, on what we told the public before, and it would invite some integration as well. So maybe that's a good template for thinking about the next meeting. I'm not sure. I forgot who was first. Pam,
No,
Carrie.
but-
Yeah. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
first of all, absolutely what Court said, it makes sense. Anything that's in the public domain, there's a lot of, so you can do Superfund 101 for the public, and we could do that, and as to things that are relevant to our site. So I 100% agree with Court. I think we always have to be careful about how much we're giving the public that is just theoretical and not real for them, which gets to my support, I think, for what Gary's suggesting, and that is that it's not so much when we have this meeting, it's what's the content, why are we having it, and what are we saying? And one of the models that often is used in government is just when you get a focused sense of where you may be going, a focused feasibility study, a focused environmental impact statement. You go out to the public saying, this is where we may be headed. You have enough meat on it so that the public can see the basis for it and why you may be heading in that direction, but that you haven't made up your mind by any means. And you've got a contentful meeting that the public can respond to, and that I don't think that's that uncommon in decision making. And I think that's kind of what Gary's saying. But importantly, I don't think the question is when to have this meeting. It's when is it appropriate, and shouldn't we have a focused enough sense of where we're headed to have the public have something to wrap its head around?
Yeah, I agree. It's more, the what is more important than the when. However, the when is not unimportant, given we have to figure out, because we are going to brief the select board. We are, it's somewhere we have to decide on the when. We don't have to do that tonight. But I do agree. It's sort of the what, and that will inform the when. But it's the when we still have to think about in the next month or two. Carrie, and then Gary, and then Kurt.
My comment actually goes back 3 or 4 speakers, but to when Gary was talking about what we might do with 2 more public forums versus 1, and the timing gets awfully tight, because I don't know how many people would show up at a public forum in the second week of July. But if that is sort of a status point, here are the things we're considering, here are the findings that we've gotten from our 4 work streams. And then depending on what the public's reaction to that, what questions, what comments, are there things that potentially people would bring up later, as if, why didn't you look at this, and attack the report, challenge the validity of our report, an opportunity to go back to them, to the public. So a decision on whether there were a 3rd public forum, in my mind, if the timing worked out so that there was meaningful participation, reserve judgment on whether there's actually a 3rd public forum.
Yeah.
Based on the public, what we think we're hearing from the public before we go with the final report to the select board.
Thank you. Gary?
And just quickly building on that, and just, I raised my hand to say I totally agree with what Court said. I totally agree with what, you said, Paul. I think the content is pretty clear. And I think the nervousness around timing is a concern of what we're not going to say. Nobody is going to stand up in April or in July or even in October and say, we recommend the town acquire and build housing. That's what I think people are nervous about. What we're going to be doing is saying, the content is going to be, here's what we've learned about various legal avenues for the town and the select board to consider. Here's what we've learned about 3 different scenarios for the town to consider and the costs associated and infrastructure associated with that. Here's what we've learned about safety. And based on that, we're still formulating, some thoughts about how the select board can move forward. And, I think we stop short, whatever we determine the maximum public impact can be achieved. If that's June, not July, then we ought to have this meeting in June. If it's May, we ought to have the meeting in May. We should time the meeting, and I would defer to David on this, whenever we're going to get maximum public input and maximum public engagement, and give them what we have at that time. And then, we'll write the report however we write the report. And then I just think having a public opportunity to comment, whether it's just one of our regular committee meetings or a select board meeting or whatever, makes sense towards the end of it.
Yeah. Great. Kurt?
I guess I wanted to raise a related topic, which is how we can get better public participation in these biweekly meetings so that our recommendations down the road and our deliberations don't be a surprise to the public. I know it's kind of a separate topic, but it seems like maybe we're missing an opportunity to have the public involved in these biweekly meetings that are occurring on a frequent basis. We have 10 meetings going forward over the next 5 months. So is there a way we can get the public more involved in these meetings on a routine basis?
Wow.
That's-
Good question. I certainly don't have an answer for that. The
I've
hotter
got
the,
good-
the hotter the topic, the more it's publicized, the more people are going to
Right.
chime in. But how to get this topic hotter and more in people's minds? It's a good question. David Ropik?
One of the things I think we need to bear in mind with all of this is strategically why we want to have that meeting. What's the goal? And I would encourage us to keep in mind that the goal is this relationship we want the town to have with us, that they feel included and that we've been open. So the number of people who participate, Kurt, it's better if it's more. But if we've shown good faith in encouraging that, and because it's still in a theoretical stage, an information gathering stage, an early stage with Warner's Pond as the example again, and fewer people come, that's okay. Their input would help. The availability to them of having the opportunity to make that input is a message from us that is also important. So I'm not sure what we could do to encourage greater participation in the biweekly meetings. You just brought that up. I'll have to think about that. At this point, I don't think much, quite frankly, because I think a lot of committees in town do a lot of stuff that's preliminary, and only the focused few who give a darn are engaged at that point, and that's probably where we still are. But let me think about that down the road. When we have this second, the public can communicate with us, and ask us questions and stuff. It's where we stand now. It's not what we've decided, obviously. But it is the point I wanted to make. I'll get back to it and then shut up. It's relationship building, and it's relationship building for a reason. So when we make our recommendation to the select board, they will have to then act as they see fit, right? And then it becomes real, right? And we're laying foundations now for how the conversation with the town is going to go when they act. And the more open and the more engaged the community feels with us now, the more that's going to help that conversation be productive. So the goal of all of this, as we think about it, is that in my strategic thinking. I wanted to add
Yeah.
that.
Thank you. Pam and then Carrie, and then I'll have one more comment, then we'll move on unless there's some burning issue. Go ahead.
So it struck me that there are two good meetings that we might have that the public might be involved in this group's meeting as opposed to a big public meeting. One is when Rue presents information about how safe each area is to work on. And that would be perhaps the group where we advertise that meeting as our consultant is presenting us the risk information, and we're going to have a discussion about how comfortable people are putting housing on this site. And that can get the people who want to complain about housing at the site or who have interest in housing at the site to come to that particular meeting and give us input before we're writing a report, before we're making decisions. And the other one would be if we actually have a legal meeting where Mina is presenting that, not as an executive session, but in a public part of the meeting where we can have people who have been interested in the liability and been interested in how the town would take it without getting a lot of costs and things like that to be able to ask those questions. Those are two groups of people that, one is it safe for housing and one is it, safe for liability, that have an interest in our work, that when we're actually talking about the things that interest them, we can get them invited to that meeting.
Yeah. Carrie?
Yes, okay. My comment here has to do with how difficult it will be to get people to pay attention to, whether they come in person or watch online, our meetings over the next couple of months as we head into town meeting. Because there are people who sort of ignore things until they see something in the warrant, or there's an article about something that's on the town, coming up to town meeting this year, and we're not there. We're whatever we do, we're not there. So that really gets me back to the earlier discussion about trying to make use of the Concord Bridge so that people, when they're sitting with their feet up on Friday night, will come across this article when they're, looking for something else to read. And then maybe when we do have a public forum and we're advertising that, promoting that, we can reach back to things that have been talked about through that line. If that makes sense to people. I just think it's a really challenging time to try to build an audience for our committee meeting. I mean, you can even look at when you watch a select board meeting and see how many people are tuned in online. It's not, it's not 150 people.
Yeah. We had 100 people at the last meeting, and they had a little bit of fatigue because EPA had just had their meeting before. And I think there was a Warner's Pond meeting that same night. And they attended the meeting, which basically we were telling them what our plan was, what we're going to do. I would have to think if we now tell them we're following up on that. To David's point about building trust, we've told you what we're going to do and what questions we're going to ask. Here's what we found. Here's some of the answers to the questions. Here's some real information. No decisions, but here's some real information. I have to think that at least the people who attended the last time would come to actually hear, okay, there's real information. They told us plans. Nobody fell asleep during the plans. I think, and if we use the bridge to sort of advertise that, hey, come, and these guys are going to talk about what their initial findings were. They've done a lot of research. They've spoken to a lot of people. So I do think that the context for the content, you should all look at what you talked about at the public forum. What questions, what we're looking for, what our goals were, because I think it's a logical follow-up. This is what you heard about. Now, here's what we found. I think that's pure good information without getting into deliberations or opinions, I guess. Court, last comment on this, and then we'll kind of move on. Go ahead. You're muted.
Thank you. Sorry, I think we should continue this conversation at the next meeting. I think we all agree that one thing we're trying to avoid is reaching the conclusion of our process only to hear a chorus of people in town who wondered how we got there. We're all saying that in different ways, but seems to be the consensus that we want to minimize that. Another option for us might be, for further consideration at another meeting, is do we pick half a dozen meetings where we send an ambassador and ask for 5 minutes on the agenda, and then it becomes another 5 as they pitch questions at us. Should we go before the Board of Health? Should we go before the Council on Aging? Should we go before the PTG presidents of all the schools? I don't know. But it's true. People aren't going to pay attention until the 11th hour, and why should they? It's unreasonable to expect them to with 60 committees in this town, all busy doing important things. But that might be a way. Instead of waiting for anybody to come to us, we go to them with some precision, those very few groups that we think have an agenda that would fit us right in.
I think it's a good idea if we can find those groups that have a large audience at their meetings. But to brief the Board of Health, no offense, Kurt, I don't know how many people come to those meetings. That might be 6, 7 people, and I mean that's probably necessary but not sufficient. So I think that's another way of doing it, Court. We should rule that out.
I don't want to make work for us. That's not my intent.
Yeah. So let me stop the discussion.
One point there, Court's suggestion, at least you get the attention of the people who are actively serving on town committees. And that may help to spread the word with people who are paying attention, even if it is the 5 minutes. I appreciate that suggestion, Court. I don't know, exactly where or when or how, but that is a way to reach out to people who are paying attention to what's happening in Concord.
Yep. Hopefully, last word on this. Again, back to the plan here. So if we really have done our research and we're pretty good shape by the end of March-ish or maybe April, during this time period, I think we have enough content to talk about in another public forum in here. I think we could have a lot of information, a lot of, at least the follow-up would be talked about in our previous forum that we told them what we were going to do. And then shortly thereafter, with the select board on what we're thinking, maybe a more pointed discussion on things that we're focusing on, criteria for making our recommendations. I mean, we haven't discussed as a group 2 things. We haven't discussed criteria for making recommendations. Sounds, maybe it's not an easy topic. And also, so how are we going to vote? And just as an aside, I was at the Warner's Pond task force meeting, and the consultant came up, somebody came up with the idea of how they're going to vote and make a decision, because Warner's Pond, it's a contentious issue. And I'm just going to tell you what they decided to do on voting. They decided that whatever recommendation was needed, they would need 75% of the voting members to make their recommendations, and that the voting members would have 3 options: whether they could strongly support the decision, whether they could live with the decision, don't love it but could live with it, or whether they would oppose the decision, of course abstaining. I just throw that out there because I thought it was an interesting way to proceed, and we should discuss all that. I'm not saying we should do that here, but I'm just saying, to think, and maybe we're going to get everybody on the same page. We're all voting thumbs up on whatever recommendation. That'd be great. But we'll have to, at some point, not tonight, figure out how the criteria for making decisions and how we're going to make the decision. That doesn't occur to our integration phase, but I'm just kind of putting that out there. I think one of our next meetings, we ought to dig into the next public forum a little bit more deeply, think about that, guys. And because we had a lot of good discussion, I think we have general consensus that we need some good content following up on the previous briefing and something short of deliberations and decisions, but something that would be of interest to the public, that would be relevant to our decisions. So think about how we would do that. I'll put that on the agenda for maybe the next meeting. So speaking of next meetings, let me just a second, Corey, I want to put this up. If I still have this somewhere. No, I don't have it. One second, everybody. I thought I had the meeting dates up here and I don't. So so the next meeting is scheduled for the 27th, and then we have the 2 meetings in March. And at that point, I think we're going to have to decide how do we schedule our meetings in the, I'll call the integration period. So I haven't done any scheduling beyond the next 3 meetings, but and hopefully they'll be in person. I see 2 hands raised, Pam 1 and then Pam H, then Pam R.
It's just a random, I don't know where you put this, but I've, and this is in the interest of letting the public believe that we're being as thorough as possible. Way back, and this goes to the review of the sites that are similarly situated, other municipalities that have acquired contaminated properties. We don't have, I think we have yet to see a list or any revelations of towns that have not acquired such properties. And maybe it's the null set, but I would like us to do that because it will give assurance to people that we're looking not only at acquisition scenarios by other towns, but also those towns and that had the same or similar contaminated properties that chose for whatever reason not to acquire. And I think that if such towns exist, we really should include them in our thinking.
Great.
And I thought that Skio or somebody was going to do that work, and I don't think we've seen it. And I would be perfectly happy if somebody did a scrub and said, guess what? There are no such towns because everybody buys or acquires, and that would be fabulous. But I think it's probably not the case, and I think we should have that information.
And following up on that, the topic of what is the town's control, quote unquote control, of the site, should they decide not to acquire it? Is that in, Carl, is that in your court to handle in the ownership issue, or is that sort of, where does that fall right now in terms of thinking? I mean, it's a bit of a legal piece, but there's zoning, there's permitting, there's other things. Is that?
I don't think it was in our charge.
No.
I'm not sure. I do think there was at least one example, Fairhaven, from the research that chose not to acquire. So I do think we have at least one example. I don't know how much follow-up Pam or Carrie or David did on what the development outcomes were of the town after they didn't acquire.
Okay, so we're gonna have to cover that eventually, sort of, at the town, if the decision is not to acquire, then where does that leave the town in terms of the site? I'll just leave it there for now, but David, Court, then Pam.
There were towns that we inquired of that did not acquire some of the property. Ashland did not require some of the property. Billerica, which I didn't include, Iron Horse Park, chose not to acquire some of the property. It wasn't as clean as ours. There, Woburn Wells G&H, for example, the town maintained control only of the wellhead property they already owned, and there were 2 other sections of the property that they didn't acquire. So it's in there, kind of, Pam. We stumbled across them. We were kind of working from towns that had Superfund sites. And there were some examples where towns chose not to pursue that.
I think, and if I may, I think those are really important pieces of data.
Yeah, I agree.
I think that it seems like those have been underplayed a little bit, and I think it damages our credibility a little also. And it also may undermine our full thinking on all of this. So I really think we have to flesh those out. I also think just in this vein, in terms of just the structure of the report and what we put in the report, I think we do need to include something in the nature of other options. Other things that are not acquisition and are not bright line, don't do anything. There are probably a range of things that require some thinking that should be included in the report that are not, as I've said before, this binary condition, the way that we're thinking it. I mean, there could be joint ownership with the state. There could be partial ownership. There could be, don't do anything until the site is till 2028 and see what we find in 2028. I don't necessarily ascribe to any of those, but I think we have to have a piece of our thought process that includes those sorts of, here's some other considerations that you need to pay attention to.
I'm open to that as long as they're not totally speculative. I mean, if there are examples of that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
So let me, three last comments, and then we'll go to public comment and we'll adjourn. Pam, Court, and Rich.
So there were examples. There was the one example of somebody who just never took it, which was the Fairhaven. And their view of that was that it just wasn't something they would even think about. Why would we even think about this, wanting it from that perspective? People who evaluated it because they had a use for it generally took it and were happy taking it. And the other example was Ashland, which at first didn't think they would ever want to take it until the other ways of preventing major housing developments on the site failed, and they went back and took part of the site in order to control a housing project at that site. We don't really seem to have examples where somebody controlled things with zoning, or somebody controlled things successfully with trying to find those. Pam, is really a challenge. And I had a public comment when you get back to me. So
Okay, Court and Rich. Mute.
You're muted, Court.
Let's save 1 minute before we finish to talk about the NMI site visit, also 2 weeks from today.
Right, that was going to be my closing comments. Great. Rich?
Well, I think, on the non-acquisition, I think we would expect to outline zoning uses that would be permitted and seem to have some, market interest. And number two, we have actually talked with private developers about the idea of easements for things that the town would want if it didn't acquire. And I think we definitely want to talk about that. I mean, I think you could potentially get a battery site, you could get a dog park, you could get things like that with an easement.
Okay. Well, good. Good meeting. Court had mentioned, and I'll follow up. There is a DeMaximus site meeting on Tuesday the 27th at 10 a.m. Further information on aspects of remediation, it's open to you guys and others if you want to attend. Court, anything else you wanted to say about that? Okay. I will just share my screen because I found the document, and you all know this. So these are our next meetings. We have the 27th, which is going to be on Kai's Road because there's a conflict with this space, and hopefully it won't get snowed out. And then the two meetings in March 12th and 26th. So again, my inclination is to spend some time on the 27th talking about the ideas about the public forum, to spend one of these meetings in March after we consult with Mina and Megan and others on discussing legal aspects with the whole group, but we'll get back to that. And with that, let me invite public comment or Pam putting on her public hat. Go ahead.
So when we were part of the reuse committee, we had talked to Minuteman Arc about whether they wanted any of the site for anything, if they thought housing would be an appropriate thing on that site, because they do practically back up to the site along Main Street there. They're on Forest Ridge Road. There's a thin barrier that is owned by the town, like 10 feet wide. And then there is the StarMed site. And they had said at that time they weren't interested in housing, but Carrie spoke to them again, and they have a great need for single occupancy, small apartments for high functioning, developmentally disabled adults. And that turns out to be an advantageous site because they could do emergency services from that if they had to send staff over there from their building right next door. It's a real advantage. And the reason I'm bringing it up is because the site, the part of the site that backs up to them is that A2 wooded area right along Main Street, where you could have an entrance from Main Street if you wanted to and not be part of the site. And my question about it is that border between Minuteman Arc for the people on Forest Ridge Road have like a 10-foot border between them and the StarMed site that's town owned. And I don't know, could you ever build a road that goes over that site or the back entrance that way? Are there, Gary, are there conservation restrictions about that? Because that having back access there, having access on Main Street, those things could isolate housing so that it wouldn't feel like it's part of a Superfund site and that it's somehow that we're doing something like that. And Carl, my question about that is, are there funding sources for developing that kind of housing? So those are long-term questions,
so those,
but I thought since they've had a change of heart about that, they would actually like to see this parts of the property used for housing, that's something that I think we should think about pretty seriously because of how the location there and because of the particular area also could be cleared for development by using that to restore the rest of the site, and that would help with keeping invasives down if you're only moving from one part of the site to another and not bringing in another source of fill.
Okay, thank you for the comment. Task force, let's not discuss that here, but take that into account. That's great comment. Other, I see Carrie, I'm not going to call on you yet because we're in the public comment period. Any other comments from the public? I see no hand raised, so I will go to Carrie.
Hi, I'm sorry. This is going back to what Pam was just talking about, because I had tried to reach the executive director there before Carl and Rich and Gary and I met. It turns out that the reason I didn't hear back from her was because she was out of town, and she called me on the day she got back, but that was after we had met. So, but it was an interesting idea, you know, and it fits in some interesting ways. And I'll just leave it at that right now. Thank you for bringing it up, Ken.
Okay, we're close to adjournment. I want to thank you all. Thank you to the public, Wendy and Haley for joining us, and thanks to Karen and Kat, and of course Megan and Chris for attending as well. And with that, we'll adjourn the meeting.